Hello. In the previous segment, we talked about the vast influence of Al Lindsay's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, in the 1970s, selling something like 25 million copies the first go-round. And it made one interpretation of Revelation the official interpretation for tens, if not hundreds of millions of people, because then that interpretation got into the airwaves through TV ministries, and is now virtually the only explanation that most Pentecostals and conservative Christians believe in.
So it's popularized that version.
Now Lindsay gave you the pop version, and the TV evangelists give you even a more diluted pop version of the same thing. But the source is really Dallas Theological Seminary. Now, a lot of the work that Dallas Seminary has done over the decades has been wonderful, but on the other hand, they've locked themselves into a certain system of eschatology, including interpretation of Daniel and Revelation. So John Walvoord, who was president of Dallas Seminary, is no longer with us, but was president of Dallas Seminary and was their foremost New Testament and Old Testament interpreter during these decades before Lindsay came along. So Walvoord is, as it were, the official interpreter of the dispensational premillennial position. So we should read what he says about this passage, Revelation 14, verse 20. He says, he says,
I will read it. Okay. The unusual expression that the blood splatters to the horses' bridles for 1,600 furlongs has intrigued expositors. The scene of this event is apparently the city of Jerusalem, outside which judgment takes place. The area covered, 1,600 furlongs, is approximately 200 miles, and specifies that the area within a 200-mile radius from Jerusalem will be the center of the final carnage, where the armies of the world will be gathered at the time of the second coming of Christ. The land of Israel covers about 200 miles from the north to the south, and the reference to distance may mean that this area is in view rather than a more extensive territory of 200 miles in all directions from Jerusalem.
We might make the comment right off the bat that you notice no matter which commentator we're looking at, this is not about Salt Lake City, Rome, or Dallas, even in the case of the dispensationalists. This is about a place on earth. If it's about any place, it's about one place. That is the area around Jerusalem. That's what the text indicates. Some don't want to go there, don't want to make it local at all, as you saw with Caird. It's more symbolic for him. But nobody goes out on the limb.
At least they don't, because it doesn't specify, they don't want to say it is this. You see him being more dogmatic.
He's more
the previous ones we read.
I guess I would want to say specific as opposed to dogmatic. That he wants to make the references more local. But he's not locked into this must be. And it's from God.
He is the influence for the popularized view.
Yes, he is. But it needs to be said that Walvoord is far more cautious in the way he approaches it than a lot of his interpreters are.
Okay.
So that's Walvoord, and that's 1966 again, before Lindsay came along. I wanted to go back now to a couple of commentaries that bear upon the period of Russell and Rutherford, just to see what commentators of Christendom were saying at the very same time.
Right.
As Rutherford is saying Scranton to Bethel, New York, Brooklyn. What were they saying about this very same passage? And the first one I wanted to deal with was this fellow, Robert Govett. Robert Govett. 2 volumes, beautiful volumes, as you can see, embossed like the books used to be when they were well bound 150 years ago.
They look beautiful.
Beautiful. The Apocalypse Expounded.
They feel beautiful.
They feel beautiful. Embossed.
Yes.
So I picked these up at a garage sale of all places on Pape Avenue in downtown Toronto about 25 years ago, and I couldn't believe it. What are these doing at a garage sale? It's 4 volumes in 2 volumes, so you can see it's massive. I just wanted to read you what a well-known bibliophile, Wilbur Smith, said about Govett's work. specifically these books. Because Wilbur Smith, you may have seen him in one of our other videos talking about books. He's maybe the foremost bibliophile among the last generation of North American scholars. And Wilbur Smith said this about Govett.
We used him a lot.
In assembling library.
Our library,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah, we used him to assemble our library. Professor Smith said this about Govett and this book. One of the profoundest expositions of the book of Revelation that I know is the work of Robert Govett. My own opinion is that he brings to his interpretation a more thorough knowledge of the scriptures in their bearing on the last book of the Bible than any other writer of his generation. And there were dozens of commentators on Revelation in this generation. By the way, what generation is it? These were published from 1861 to 1865. These are apparently originals. You can tell by the binding. 1861 to 65, the very years of the Civil War. Govett was a British Anglican clergyman by ordination who left the Anglican Church because he began to differ with them on various things, including prophecy. So Govett became an independent minister for the rest of his life. For the last 40, 50 years of his life, he ran an independent church in Norwich, England, and had a vast influence on a lot of later writers like the Welsh Revival and Jesse Penn Lewis, and through other people to Watchman Nee and his work in China. So Govett's had a vast influence, even though his name has been kind of forgotten. So what does Govett say about this passage? This is, keep in mind, 50 years before the finished mystery.
I will read it. Should put that on the table. Keep it safe. Okay. All right. So I'm reading from here. Okay. The extent of the slaughter is terribly portrayed by a single line. A river of blood, 4 feet deep by 160 miles in length, will proceed from this destruction. So awful a sight is this, was never beheld before, but glimpses of this judgment have been given in some of the previous great slaughters among men. When Jerusalem was taken by Titus, Josephus says that the Roman soldiers slew all they met with and obstructed the very lanes with their dead bodies, and made this whole city run down with blood, to such a degree indeed that the fire of many of the houses was quenched with these men's blood.
Now that's from Josephus's Wars of the Jews, which had just come out when Revelation was written.
Wow.
So this story of the end of Jerusalem would have been very fresh in the minds that would read Revelation when it first came out.
Oh, okay. The lake of blood extends for 1,600 furlongs. Where shall we fix its 2 limits? One is evidently Megiddo, as chapter 14:16 of Revelation discovers.
16:16, I believe.
Oh yeah, you're right. It is 16:16. The other is Bozrah in the land of Edom, as Isaiah 63:1 and 34:6 will prove. Now between these 2
that is
points,
Megiddo and Bozrah.
Is just the interval of 160 miles on Hughes's map. That's in a book called Bible Maps. Jesus moves from Bozrah towards Jerusalem, and then apparently towards Jezreel or Megiddo. The 1,600 seems to be expounded of the square of 4 into the square of 10. 4 signifies the world. 10 is the rich number. Does it not then hint that this will be the full destruction of the men of earth?
So you can see Govett gets far more specific even than Balver does about what's happening here. He takes it all quite literally, and even has the distance covered exactly from Edom, Isaiah 63, through Megiddo in Revelation 16. He has it all literal, but then he says it's also got a symbolic value. The number has a symbolic value. So he goes both ways. But again, you can see between all of these commentaries, there's consistency. That is, there's only these limits to what this could be about. It's either symbolic or it's literal. But it's not speculative, endlessly speculative as we see.
He doesn't take it to England because he happens to be there.
No, he's in England, but he doesn't go to England. That's right.
Yeah.
So what they have in common, the ones we've looked at so far, is this is not about us.
Yeah.
It's about something happening over there. Yeah, I wanted to do R.H. Charles too. R.H. Charles was alive during that very same period. He was perhaps the greatest scholar on apocalyptic in the world. He did these commentaries on Revelation, which came out, interestingly, in the year 1920. This was state-of-the-art in 1920, the International Critical Commentary on Revelation in 2 volumes, totaling about 900 pages. And Charles was already famous when he did this 2-volume commentary, which was very rare in those days, by the way, 2-volume commentaries of anything. Not so rare now. But when he did it, he was already famous. And the reason he was famous is because of these. The Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament. Vast works of erudition. He was the foremost writer and scholar on apocalyptic, on the intertestamental literature from the end of the Old Testament to the New Testament. He was the world's greatest expert. And he demonstrated it in these volumes. So, this, by the way, is still state-of-the-art. It's never been superseded in nearly 100 years. Well, over 100 years. It's 1913 they were put out. So when Charles wrote what he writes on Revelation, people paid attention. So what did he write in 1920, at the very same moment as Finished Mystery was going around the world? And Millions Now Living Will Never Die was being published.
Okay.
And what did he write about this passage, 1420? There can be no question as to the identity of the city. It is not Rome, for its destruction has already been announced in the hearing of the seer in 9, but Jerusalem. That's verse 9, he means. It's not Rome, but Jerusalem. It is, moreover, most probably not the earthly Jerusalem, but the heavenly Jerusalem, which is to descend from heaven to be the center of the kingdom of Christ for the 1,000 years. For in the notes on 20, 1-6, we shall see that the heavenly Jerusalem, described in 21, 9 to 22, 2, is in reality the city that is to come down from heaven to take the place of the old Jerusalem and become the capital of Christ's kingdom for the 1,000 years. So if 14:14 and 18 to 20 is a proleptic summary of 19:11 to 21, can you follow? If he's connecting chapter 14 to chapter 19 here, then the city referred to might be the historic Jerusalem. So he says it might be the Jerusalem of today. But I think it's the heavenly Jerusalem coming down, notice, to replace it on earth. So even Charles, the greatest scholar in the world on prophecy at that time, and maybe ever, still says there's at least 2 options here, but they're both involving Jerusalem.
Yeah.
If 14:14 is proleptic, then the city referred to might be the historic Jerusalem, or rather its ruined site. But if this is a summary of 19:11 to 21, and also 27 to 10, then the city can be none other than the city that came down from heaven, the seat of the Messianic kingdom. So notice he's talking about a Messianic kingdom, not in heaven, but on earth. And the capital is there, even if it's a new city, it's there. Jewish tradition had long associated the neighborhood of Jerusalem with the scene of the judgment of the Gentiles. According to Joel 3, 2 and 12, God was to assemble and judge the Gentiles in the valley of Jehoshaphat, a phrase which Theodotion renders by, I'll leave that Greek phrase out, because I don't know how to read Greek. According to the Midrash, God was to judge the whole world in this valley. It is referred to in 1st Enoch. You might remember it was referred to in Enoch, one of the other commentaries. So there's a comparison in the Pseudepigrapha, the book of Enoch, but there's also comparison in Zechariah, Charles says. Zechariah also speaks of a judgment of the Gentiles who laid Jerusalem desolate, being executed on the Mount of Olives. 14 verse 2. Remember that one? His feet, Jehovah's feet, will that day land on the Mount of Olives.
Right.
In our author, it is all the heathen nations that are to be similarly judged. And then he talks about the number, 1600. As regards the number itself, various explanations have been offered, but none is absolutely convincing. Some have found in 1600 the idea of completeness, and therefore inferred that the deluge of blood swept over the whole earth, the holy city alone being exempt. Others have conceived that Palestine only was designed by the number, since according to Jerome, the length of Palestine from Dan to Beersheba was 160 miles. But 160 miles is only 1,280 stades. A nearer approach to the number in our text is to be found in the itinerarium of Antoninus, according to which Palestine was said to be 1,664 stades from Tyre to El Arish. And he gives his preference as to which is the right interpretation. He says, of the two above interpretations, I'm inclined to adopt the former. The more we study chapter 14, the more clear it becomes that it deals with the same subject as chapter 19. For 14 clearly state that the judgment is that of the whole earth, hence it is not merely the heathen nations that had submitted to the anti-Christian empire of Rome that are destroyed in 19, but likewise all the remaining heathen nations that rebel against the kingdom of Christ after the lapse of the 1,000 years. Hence the slaughter is commensurate with the inhabited world. So it's clear Charles's preference is with the idea of a global Armageddon scenario, but he still grants that it's localized.
Yeah, and he says things like, my inclination is. So they're not setting it in stone here.
Yeah.
They're not proclaiming, you got to believe this. They're leaving you something to wrestle with yourself, to consider what you think, seems to make the most sense.
Yeah, God has not given us these things in propositions. They're in images and symbols.
Especially in a prophetic book like Revelation, which is full of pictures.
Yeah, and I think when you get to your Michael Gorman recommendation, you're going to be talking about the nature of the book itself being apocalyptic.
Yeah.
So in one of the future segments, we'll get to that.
Mm-hmm.